that we began last week in the Old Testament book of Ruth. You're going to be making your way there. In that lesson, we're introduced to this family whose story is really the focal point of the book. We saw the tragic circumstances that kind of set the stage for the events that will transpire throughout the rest of the short book. A famine had driven the family out of their homeland in Bethlehem of Judah to live in a foreign land of Moab. There wasn't any food, there wasn't any provision for them, and so they sought it out in the place where there was plenty. Once there, the father passed away, leaving the wife and 2 sons behind to kind of take care of themselves. They stayed there in Moab for an extended period of time, and while there, the 2 sons each married Moabite women. Before you know it, a decade passed. And whenever I was young, I thought, how could that happen? Now that I'm a little older, I can see how time passes and things move right along, and sometimes you look back and you don't hardly realize how much time has passed. But for them, 10 years passed, and after that time, the 2 sons passed away as well. And so now Naomi, the wife, is left alone as far as direct family, but she does have her 2 daughters-in-law who were there with her, obviously at the loss of their husbands. They're widows as well. And so you've got these 3 widows living in Moab, one who is an Israelite from Bethlehem, and the other 2 who are Moabite women from there in that region. That's where we pick up the story this evening in Ruth chapter 1. We'll start off with verses 6 and 7. Here the Bible says, "Then she arose with her daughters-in-law, that she might return from the country of Moab, for she had heard in the country of Moab how that the Lord had visited his people in giving them bread. Wherefore she went forth out of the place where she was, and her 2 daughters-in-law with her, and they went on the way to return unto the land of Judah." So while Naomi and her family were in Moab, the situation back home in Bethlehem improves. The famine has passed, and the means by which God did that, we aren't sure. We aren't sure exactly why the famine was there in the first place, the exact time frame, or anything like that. It seems likely, based on the general time frame of the time of the judges, that it may be that when they left, it was during the oppression of one of the enemies of the nation of Israel, perhaps even the Moabites, to whose land they went. But it may be that God had raised up a judge in that intervening time, and now things were better in Israel, things were better in Bethlehem, so that they'd be able to find provision there, and they'd be able to be taken care of if they returned back to Bethlehem. Whatever the source of the change, Naomi determines that it's time for her to return back to the place of her childhood, to the place of happier days in her life. Moab hadn't brought much happiness. It brought a lot of suffering, a lot of sorrow, a lot of difficulty to her life. And so she's looking back to Judea. She's looking back to Bethlehem with some longing and with that desire to go back home, to go back to where things had been better. The 2 daughters-in-law show their affection and respect for Naomi by accompanying her on her way out of Moab. Whenever we went to Conway this Christmas to visit with my family, reading this kind of reminded me of whenever my mom and dad and Mamaw were about to head back to Camden. We were inside the house, and they were about to go, and so we were all saying our goodbyes and everything like that. And then after that was done, well, they head outside, and what happens? Well, several of us follow them outside. Now, we had already said goodbye, we had already taken care of all that, but we followed them out there, and we watched them get in the car, and we watched them drive away. We weren't going to go to Camden, we weren't going to hop in the car with them or anything like that, but we kind of wanted to go as far as we practically could go with them, right? And we wanted to see them off and let them know that we loved them and say our goodbyes and all those kind of things. And that's kind of what's happening here. Now, how far they would practically go is a little farther probably than we would typically practically go, because they were going to journey with her for a while as she headed back toward her homeland. Now, initially, it probably wasn't with the idea that they would continue all the way to Judah or to Bethlehem. They probably had planned on just traveling with her a little while, again, kind of the customs of that day and age, to join with her and to show their support, but at some point they would likely have turned back and returned to their homeland from, back to their families and back to what they had known before they had married her sons. So that's what Ruth and Orpah are doing here for Naomi. Now, after some time, Naomi stops to say her goodbyes, to kind of finalize these things, and possibly this would have taken place around the border of Moab and Judah. Remember, Israel was to the west of the Dead Sea and the Jordan River, and Moab is kind of to the south and east of Israel, of Bethlehem, across the Dead Sea. And so they're probably likely near that border between those two lands, where she's going to say her goodbyes, and she's going to allow them to return back to her family. Verse 8 there in our text says, "And Naomi said unto her two daughters-in-law, Go, return each to her mother's house, and the Lord deal kindly with you as you have dealt with the dead and with me. The Lord grant you also that you may rest, or that you may find rest, each of you in the house of her husband." Then she kissed them, and they lifted up their voices and wept. So Naomi instructs the women to return to their homes, where they were brought up, to their mother's homes, and to continue life among their own families, among their own people. This was probably kind of the normal way of dealing with this kind of situation, where the husband passed away and the widow was left, for her to return back to her family and be taking care of them, especially in a situation like this where there's nobody else on the husband's side of the family basically left to take care of her. Remember, this was a culture where women had very few options when it came to providing for themselves. And so their best bet as far as finding a stable and happy life was to find a husband, find somebody and remarry, since they were still both young enough to go ahead and raise families. Naomi then speaks of two blessings that she wants the women to receive from God. The first is kind of a general blessing of God's kindness upon them, and the way she describes it is basically that God would bless in proportion to their kindness toward her and to her sons. Apparently both of these daughters-in-law had been good daughters-in-law. They had been good family members, good wives to their husbands. They had treated them well. They had treated her well. And so Naomi's grateful. And this is kind of in part showing that gratitude that she has for their kindness toward her, and even this journey that they had made with her. It showed their respect. It showed their compassion and their concern for her. And so she recognizes that and responds to that, and seeks God's blessing, God's kindness upon them in like manner. So we see also that she has an understanding of God's place, that God is the one who's in control of all things, including blessings. Now, in this time, in these cultures, typically, the idea was that there's a lot of different gods, and every little region kind of has their own god. And so the god of Moab would have power in Moab, but the god of Israel would have power in Israel, and the god of the Philistines would have power over them. And so her request for them, or her blessing upon them from the God of Israel, from Jehovah, was kind of unusual, because it wasn't "may your gods bless you," it's "may God bless you." And that speaks of the understanding that she had of the true nature of God, that God is the one God, that there aren't a lot of different gods. People may worship things, and they may think that there are a lot of different gods, but there's one true God, and He's the source of blessing. And so she seeks for His blessing to be upon these daughters-in-law, and His goodness to be a part of their life. The second blessing dealt with the circumstances that they were left in as widows, which again in that culture was considered a reproach. If you were a widow, it was kind of looked down upon. It was looked as if you had done something wrong to bring this upon yourself. And so it was very difficult sometimes for widows to get the provision that they needed, and to be taken care of, or even to be considered for second marriage and things like that. So they were in a difficult spot as far as the culture, and as far as the prospects that they had for the future looked. And so she prays that God would bless them, and that they would find place to reside. They would find a husband to marry. They would find a household to lead and to raise up children in, and that God would bless them in that very special way. And it kind of hints at the idea that Naomi felt a certain responsibility for these two and for the situation that they were in. And we'll see that played out a little bit more as we go on. Not surprisingly, based on the experiences that these three had had together, that they had all gone through, this separation was a very emotional event. Naomi kisses them as a token of her affection toward them, and they all cry out as they weep sorely because of the sorrow that they feel. Remember, this wasn't a time where you just hop in the car and you'd run back and visit somebody. For them, this was likely to be the last time that they would ever meet. the last time that they would ever be together. And so as they're standing here, possibly on the border between Israel and Moab or wherever it was, and they're saying their goodbyes, this is really their kind of final goodbyes. This is, in their mind, the last opportunity that they're going to have to be with Naomi, to share a time with her. And so it's a very emotional experience that they're going through, a very sorrowful time for them. In the next few verses, the daughters offer to stay with Naomi and travel with her to Judah, but she insists that they remain for their own good. Verse 10, the Bible says, "And they said unto her, Surely we will return with thee unto thy people. And Naomi said, Turn again, my daughters, why will ye go with me? Are there yet any more sons in my womb that may be your husbands? Turn again, my daughters, go your way, for I am too old to have a husband. If I should say I have hope, if I should have a husband also tonight, and should also bear sons, would ye tarry for them till they were grown? Would ye stay for them from having husbands? Nay, my daughters, for it grieveth me much for your sakes that the hand of the Lord is gone out against me." And so they both give Naomi the opportunity to have them join her and to help her not only with this journey, but to continue with her, to stay with her and help provide for her as if they were her own daughters, to take care of her in that way. First, she explains why this was a bad idea, right? She tells them, this just doesn't make sense. Return to your homes, and she repeats that a couple of times. And she gives some good reasons. First, she says that she's well past the age of bearing children or having a husband or starting a family. She was older by this point. Her two sons were already grown. She wasn't going to remarry. She wasn't going to start a family or anything like that. And then she goes kind of to the hypothetical side. And even if she were, right, even if she took a husband that very day, she found somebody to marry her and she was able to have children, she says, look, you'd have to wait years and years before they were old enough to marry, to start a family. And would you want to wait that long? And of course, the answer is that just doesn't make any sense. It's not practical. It's not reasonable to expect that from them. She appreciates their offer. She appreciates the attitude that they had and their dedication to her. But she recognizes that it just doesn't make a lot of sense, practically speaking, for them to come with her, and that there's really not many prospects where she's going, even for them. Not only for her as an older widow, but even for them as young widows. There wasn't a lot of prospects generally that they would have to look forward to. And so she gives a lot of good reasons why they shouldn't stay, a lot of good reasons for them to return home. Then we see again kind of the sense of guilt there that Naomi has about what's happening with these women, believing that their suffering is because of God's hand against her. Now, if this assessment is correct, then it certainly would give evidence to the idea that her and her husband were wrong in going to Moab in the first place. We talked about that a little bit last week. I'm not convinced of that necessarily, because the Bible isn't real explicit on she did this and it was wrong, or he made this decision and it was wrong. Certainly, their staying there may not have been the best idea or the best plan that they could develop, but sometimes God's people go through hard times, and it's not a direct result of sin. I think Job's a great example of that. And I mentioned last week that one of the commentaries that I looked at whenever I was studying, I kind of made that comparison between Naomi and Job, and how they both suffered through a lot of things and faced a lot of hardships, and kind of went through a point in their lives where they didn't have anything left, where they really had lost their families, they lost all their possessions and things like that. And it may be that God this was part of God's plan, that she would have to endure this test, that she would face these trials. But either way, it's hard to deny the fact that she felt a certain responsibility for the state that these two young women were in, and their situation that was going to be difficult for them in their lives, that she well knew and understood. But whether, again, it was an act of judgment or simply a test that Naomi was facing, Ruth and Orpah had a decision to make. Right? They offered. They said, "We'll come with you." Naomi says, "No, that doesn't make sense. Here's all the reasons why you shouldn't." But ultimately, they're going to have to make a decision. Am I going to go back to Bethlehem, or am I going to go to Bethlehem, or am I going to go back to Moab to my family? Verse 14, they make that decision. It says, "And they lifted up their voice and wept again, and Orpah kissed her mother-in-law, but Ruth clave unto her." So, there's this moment of deep emotion once more. The two daughters-in-law must decide whether to depart or whether to stay with Naomi, their mother-in-law, their dear friend who they care so much about. Orpah kisses Naomi, basically saying goodbye and departing, following the advice of the older lady and saying, I'm going to go back to my people, I'm going to go back to my family, and I'm going to try to start a new life there and find a new situation, new circumstance for myself. Ruth, however, is very determined to stay by Naomi's side, despite the bleak outlook of the circumstances that come with that decision. Naomi once more attempts to dissuade her from making that choice, verse 15. And she said, "Behold, thy sister-in-law is gone back into her people and to her gods. Return thou after thy sister-in-law." So Naomi understands the road ahead of her is going to be a hard one, and she wants to make sure that Ruth is absolutely determined that she's going to go through with this. You don't want Ruth just making an emotional kind of spur-of-the-moment decision, and then the next day or 2 days into the journey changing her mind. More than that, you don't want her to get all the way back to Bethlehem and a month later decide, you know what, I didn't know what I was signing up for, and so I don't want any part of this. She really tries to push her away, does everything that she can to say, go back to Moab, don't stay with me, don't stick to me. It's going to be hard, it's going to be difficult, there's going to be obstacles that we face, there's probably going to be some ridicule that we have to deal with, there's going to be all kinds of problems and all kinds of trouble. Go back, don't stay with me. She tries her best, basically, to try to make sure that she's certain, make sure that she's sure. It kind of reminds me of Jesus' attitude. A certain young man came to Jesus one time and said, "I'm going to follow you wherever you go." And Jesus came back and he said, "Look, I don't have a bed to sleep in. I don't have a place to lay my head. I don't have a house. I don't have, I don't have any of the things that people think of as necessities, right? I don't have these things. If you follow me, the price is high. You have to give up a lot to follow me." Another man on that same occasion said, "Well, let me go and bury my dead. Basically, I've got some elderly parents, and they're not going to be around a whole lot longer. Let me go take care of them for a little while longer, and when they pass away, then I'll come follow you." And Jesus said, "Let the dead bury their dead," right? You've got to be willing to make those sacrifices. You've got to be willing to put Him first, absolutely. And serving God, following Christ, can't be a secondary thing. It can't be something that you do in your spare time. It's got to be a priority. It's got to be important to you if you're going to do it. And that's kind of what Naomi is saying to Ruth. Look, if you have any hesitation, if there's any reason you can think of not to come with me, then don't come with me. Don't take this road if you're not absolutely certain about the choice that you're making. And so Ruth responds in verses 16 and 17. And Ruth said, "Entreat me not to leave thee or to return from following after thee. For whither thou goest I will go, and where thou lodgest I will lodge. Thy people shall be my people, and thy God my God. Where thou diest I will die, and there will I be buried. The Lord do so to me, and more also, if aught but death part thee and me." So she commits, all right? She commits for the long haul. She commits to being with Naomi through thick and thin. It says that she'll walk the same road, she'll live in the same house, she will share the same family, she will serve the same God. She even goes so far as to say that she would die in that same place. What she's saying there is, I'm not just coming back to take care of you until you die and then I'm going back to Moab. She says, I'm coming with you and I'm going to become like you. I'm going to be part of your family, and I'm not going back to Moab. I'm not going back to anything else because obviously Naomi was much older and much more likely to pass away early. And Ruth would be there a long time after Naomi was gone. But she said, even then, I'm going to stay. That's going to be my home. This isn't just a temporary thing. This isn't just because of some attachment that I have. This is genuine, and I'm making a 100% commitment that I am going to be your family. That this is going to be my home now. And so she makes that very clear and very evident in her determination. Is pretty obvious all the way around. Verse 18, Naomi doesn't really have much of a choice in how to respond, right? It says, when she saw that she was steadfastly minded to go with her, then she left speaking unto her. That doesn't mean that she gave her the cold shoulder and just wouldn't talk to her. It means that she didn't talk about that anymore, right? She didn't try to convince her anymore to go back home. At this point, their relationship was kind of cemented, and they were going to be together. Ruth was going to be with Naomi no matter what, and she recognized that. And so they begin their journey back toward Bethlehem, and eventually they reach the town. Verse 19, it says, "So they two went until they came to Bethlehem, and it came to pass, when they were come to Bethlehem, that all the city was moved about them, and they said, Is this Naomi?" So Bethlehem was a fair-sized town, not a huge city like Jerusalem or anything like that, but it was a fair-sized town. But news spread rapidly that Naomi had kind of reappeared. She had been gone so long, at least 10 years, likely somewhat more than that. Probably most people thought they'd never see her again, that she'd never be back. Friends and neighbors and all the like probably weren't expecting her to arrive the way that she did. And she comes back. Again, there were probably mixed opinions about her. There were probably, again, friends and neighbors who were happy that she had returned, who had missed her, and had been good friends with her previously. Others who probably looked down on her because of her situation. I mentioned earlier that those who were widows were oftentimes looked down upon. They were disregarded in a lot of ways, but potentially also because they had left in the first place, right? Well, you abandoned our town. You abandoned Bethlehem whenever you went to Moab. When things were hard, you took off. And so there was likely that kind of response and attitude toward a portion of the population who was there. But everybody was there was an excitement building, right? There was news was spreading around town. Those who knew her obviously would want to see her and see what was going on. Those who didn't probably saw the commotion and were wondering, well, who is this person, right, that's come back that's caused such a stir? And so the people kind of gather around, they come close, and Naomi addresses the crowd, verses 20 and 21. And she said unto them, Call me not Naomi, but Mara, for the Almighty hath dealt very bitterly with me. I went out full, and the Lord hath brought me home again empty. Why then call ye me Naomi, seeing the Lord hath testified against me, and the Almighty hath afflicted me? Remember again, we talked about it last week, that name Naomi probably means either sweetness or pleasantness. It's a good time, a good idea, a good thought that's going on with that name, a time of blessing. And she says, that doesn't really characterize my life. That's not a fitting name for me anymore. Sweetness doesn't fit. Pleasantness doesn't fit. Instead, call me Mara, and that word means bitterness. My life has been bitter. My life has been hard. My life has been sorrowful. And so she says, don't call me Naomi anymore. I'm taking upon myself this new name of Mara because of the struggles that she has. And again, we see that she views these struggles as God working against her. And she's kind of resolved to accept that in her life. This is my lot. This is the life that God has given me, and so I'm going to accept it. But don't call me Naomi. Just call me Mara. Call me bitterness, because that's what my life has kind of come to. But we'll see as we go on that while her life had been bitter and there were hard times, that God wasn't through. That God wasn't done working in her life and in the life of her daughter-in-law who had come with her. And again, if you're familiar with this book or this story, things turn out much better. And things kind of begin even in this first chapter to take that turn for the better. In verse 22, it says, So Naomi returned, and Ruth the Moabitess, her daughter-in-law, with her, which returned out of the country of Moab, and they came to Bethlehem in the beginning of the barley harvest. Now we don't know if it was Naomi's departure from Moab, if it was planned to kind of coincide with this. She might have thought ahead and said that'd be the best time to return, or she may not have, and this is just God's providence coming into play. But this really was a good time to get back into town as the harvest was just beginning. That meant there would be supplies, that there would be food to be had. During this time, there would be some provision available for the needy in the form of gleanings that would be left in the fields for their benefit. That's a requirement under the law of Moses, and we'll talk about that a little bit next week as we get into some of the further events in the book. But basically, it's a provision that's made for those who are in need, for those who don't have any other resources. It provided them a means of gathering some resources, of getting at least some food for them to eat. And to take care of them. And so their arrival coincides with those events, and it'll open the door, obviously, for God's further blessings upon these two ladies, specifically on Ruth and her faithfulness and her dedication that she shows to her mother-in-law and the Christ-like and godly character that she displays. So That'll be our focus next week as we get into chapter 2 of the book of Ruth. Any questions or comments over chapter 1?